In November 2021, a heavily armed French convoy crossed the Ivorian border into Burkina Faso en route to Niger. On their way to the Burkina Faso-Mali border, they encountered very angry protesters. The protesters were outraged about the presence of French legionnaires in the area, which was heavily devastated by the so-called Islamists in the region. According to the locals, France was supporting these jihadists to further destabilize the region. But there was a dramatic turn of events when a small boy managed to bring down a drone belonging to the French military with a slingshot as it was flying over the demonstrators. Footage of the boy and the defunct drone went viral on social media. And if you know how Africans like to exaggerate things, this boy was declared a hero almost immediately. You see, the city of Kaya isn't any ordinary city because it is close to a border between three countries: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And what do all these countries have in common with Italy? They all hate France. Well, sort of. But why? Let's dive deep into the story. In 2019, in the middle of yet another migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy at the time, Di Maio, threw heavy accusations at France. He blamed France's neo-colonial ambitions in Africa as one of the driving forces that urged Africans to migrate to Europe. Di Maio accused France of acting like a colonial power in Africa and keeping Francophone African nations impoverished by imposing the use of French-backed currencies like the CFA. He further demanded that the EU should impose sanctions on France and all countries that are impoverishing Africa and getting Africans quote-unquote off the ground. This is ridiculous, right? It is like the American Congress asking the White House to put sanctions on itself for destabilizing the Middle East. That's like shooting yourself in the foot, because we know Italy itself isn't innocent when it comes to African exploitation. Well, you know, we can say that these are just vacant claims the Italian politicians make just to drag France's name through the mud. Because France and Italy have been rivals since the beginning of time, since the Big Bang. This rivalry led Italy into invading France in the 1940s. And also, you know, there were these Napoleonic things that happened in Europe, so these countries were always at each other's neck. But things kind of settled down between them after the World War II, until recently because of Africa. So, are the claims really true? Is France exploiting Africa at all? Or should I just say, to what extent does France exploit Africa? From the window to the wall, I will make you my earl. Okay, that's uncalled for. Let me take you to the very beginning of Africa's European problem. Everything started at the end of the 19th century, when the Belgian tyrant Leopold II managed to convince the European powers to divide Africa amongst themselves. So they all met in Berlin. Everyone wanted a piece of the African cake, but France and Britain got the lion's share. Or I should say, France got the rooster or cock share and Britain got the lion's share. France controlled most of North and West Africa, Central Africa, and some part of East Africa. And that, my dear, was the beginning of colonization. But is it that bad? What really were the effects of colonization on Africans? How bad could it possibly be? Colonialism had a huge impact on the lives of Africans. European economic policies which were alien to the African soil were adopted, and this heavily devastated the colonies rather than help them. For this reason, Africa was damaged both economically and politically. Africa's traditional lifestyle and culture were destroyed during this period. Colonialism's impacts include wealth looting, environmental degradation, the spread of disease, economic instability, ethnic rivalries, and some brutal human rights violations. But these conditions were even worse in French colonies. However, things turned bitter during the call for independence. France never wanted to let go of its colonies. For example, in 1958, at the height of Africa's fight for independence, President de Gaulle of France offered a choice to French colonies in West Africa to say oui, which is yes, to a partnership with the French, or no, which meant total independence and the breaking of all links with France and all support. It was a threat. Out of all the French colonies, only Guinea and the Sekou Touré voted for a total break with France, but it was made a scapegoat. They were heavily penalized for that. the French immediately cut ties with the country, depriving them of all technical expertise, removing all key government files, even ripping out office telephones. That's how cruel the French can be. They destroyed everything France built during the colonial era, including schools, roads, hospitals, and all sorts of infrastructure. They even went to the extent of pouring concrete into the sewage systems they had built with Guinea's own money during the colonial era. This obviously served as a warning to all the other colonies. Anyone who dared to go against France from now onwards will face the wrath of the French rooster, la coq Louis. Damn, French can easily choke you. I wonder how these Africans speak it. Madagascar, on the other hand, went into an independence war with France, in the course of which over 90,000 Madagascans were massacred by French forces. However, Algerian fight for independence was the deadliest in Africa in terms of anti-colonial wars. It is estimated that by the end of the war in 1962, over 1.5 million Algerians were killed. By the 1960s, most French colonies were granted independence by France. Cause why not? Even Belgium, another brutal colonial master, was giving up its colonies, cause that was the trend at that time. But what happened after independence in the French colonies was even more worrying. The French introduced their France-Afrique policies, which made sure that France held a grip of all their colonies despite independence. The former colonies still heavily depended on France for their fiscal economic policies, military, and even their foreign affairs. They acted more like French protectorate on the international stage. You see, shortly before independence, France decided to abolish the parliamentary system in some countries like Ivory Coast and introduce a presidential regime in which all territories and powers are in the hands of the heads of states, in that you need just one man, just one puppet in these countries to get what you want. And France wanted all the juice for itself. Unfortunately, because of this imperialistic agenda, most African countries plunged into chaos after independence. Africa quickly went through an era of coup d'etats and military takeovers, some of which were orchestrated or aided by Western powers or straight out committed by their accomplices. Over 68% of these coup d'etats happened in former French colonies, not to mention all the hunger, food crisis, war, and regional instabilities that came along with them. Furthermore, the introduction of the CFA saw to it that all monetary affairs in the CFA region were heavily dependent on France. Also, CFA countries were obliged to deposit more than half of their central bank reserve in the Central Bank of France, and would also have to pay several colonial taxes to France for the benefit of colonization. What more can you do, France, to ruin a country, or perhaps an entire continent? But France still had more to offer. For this and many reasons, French colonies in Africa, despite being some of the richest in terms of natural resources, are still the poorest countries in terms of GDP. France's control over its ex-colonies was sometimes manifested through their military presence. France has the largest military presence in Africa, a privilege that France uses to ensure military support for African dictators in exchange for loyalty and exclusive access to natural resources. France's former colonies have the longest standing dictators in Africa, all of which are supported by France and immediately deposed if they go against French interests. So everyone is afraid. Give them what they want and you get what you want. Or as the famous African proverb goes, scratch my back, I scratch yours. So what happens is, these leaders surrendered the sovereignty of their countries to France in exchange for more power for themselves and more natural resources and richness for France. Take the Cameroonian president for example. He succeeded the first president of Cameroon upon the latter's surprise resignation in 1982. In the subsequent years, he staged an attempted coup in which he eliminated all his rivals, after which he ruled the Central African country till date. He has been in politics since Cameroon's independence, and until now, stands as the president of Cameroon. Okay, he can't stand anymore, but you get what I mean. So to sum up, what France does is it upholds the corrupt politicians and support them at the expense of the poor Africans. These are some of the many reasons why these countries became the hotbed of anti-French sentiments in Africa. People in these countries over time started to realize that France is at the center of all their woes, and most have expressed their frustrations against France's never-ending colonial ambitions in Africa. There have been several demonstrations against France and leaders they support in Africa, some of which have resulted in high-rank resignations or a military takeover due to unrests, as in the case of the recent coups in Guinea and Mali. And that is why these people in Burkina Faso came out in their numbers to protest against French forces who were going into Niger. They know these soldiers did not come at all to protect them from anyone, but rather they came to protect French interests in the region and loot African wealth. Even children as young as Alassane know this, but France still denies all these allegations. But what worries me more is, why is the world quiet about this? Why is Africa itself quiet about this? Well, they still have our leaders in their pockets. As the African proverb goes, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. Do you also believe that France must be sanctioned because of its imperial ambitions in Africa? Leave your thoughts in the comment section and come again next week for another dose of TRT Africa. I'm your host, Tairo Kantoshi. Don't forget to subscribe and press on the bell for all my notifications. I'll see you when I see you again. This is TRT Africa, and this is the right time for Africa.
Went to Ghana, now I'm acting up. It's so cool to be from Africa. It's so cool to be from Africa. I'm so cool I went to Africa. Back at school they would laugh at us. Tell the truth, it was cruel. Now it's too cool to be black as fuck. Now it's cool to be from Africa. Now it's cool to be from Africa. Went to Ghana, now I'm acting. Went to